Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Room for Discussion.
Today's guest made a remarkable leap from investment banking in Australia to building a media empire in Afghanistan. Raised in the Afghan diaspora, he returned to the country after the 2001 US invasion and started Moby Group, now a major media force across the Middle East, Central Asia and Africa.
Today we'll talk to Saad Mohseni about his journey building a media company in Afghanistan, as he details in his book Radio Free Afghanistan, and explore the tumults of addressing concerns across a very volatile region. And we'll also speak to why he traded stability for risk, finance for frontline journalism. And we'll talk about that and much more in the next hour. I'm Sean.
I'm Sasha. Please welcome Saad Mohseni to the stage. Please have a seat.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So,
A lot
Saad,
of questions.
we need to be prepared.
Okay.
Welcome to Room for Discussion. It is a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you.
You were born in London, spent parts of your childhood in Pakistan and Japan, then worked as an investment banker in Australia, but yet you and your sibling chose to return to Afghanistan to start a media company. So the question is, why did you make that leap?
Well, my father was an Afghan diplomat, so although we lived outside the country, we very much remained Afghans throughout. And for us, it was always a question of when do we get back? When I was about 12, there was the communist coup d'etat. And when I was about 14, the Russians invaded, the Soviets invaded. So we didn't quite have the opportunity to go back for a long, long time. And then, of course, the communist regime was toppled. The Soviets left a few years before that. The Taliban took over the country. So we had to wait till 2002 to get the opportunity to go back, which we did. And then once we were back, we just felt that, you know, I was in my mid-30s and my brother was a bit younger and my sister was in her late 20s. We felt, you know, maybe there's something we can do that could make a difference. And it just sort of, we went there not knowing we're going to spend the next 2 decades building this business, which sort of happened by accident. But I think the motivation was always, you know, what can we do? It's an exciting place to be in, exciting times. And that's how it happened.
You mentioned that it wasn't particularly planned. You mentioned in your book that you were weighing other options, an almond exporting business. What made you choose news over nuts?
Well, it was always to do something. We had to find an excuse, and the idea was that we would passively invest in different things. And the idea was that we would invest in media, we would invest in almond cultivation, various other businesses. But the media, which we hadn't expected, was so all-consuming. It was so controversial that we just couldn't do anything else. We just completely focused on media. And then we built that media business out.
So before we dig a bit deeper into what you and your company does, we'd also love to talk about, well, your personal connection to Afghanistan. Because your family, as I read, traveled along the hippie trail in the 1970s. So to a country that a few remember today. So could you tell us what was the political climate like back in the day and what kind of impact did it have on civilians?
Well, I mean, people forget, you know, people associate Afghanistan, even the rest of the Middle East, as being violent and places you can no longer visit. But you have to remember, in those days, the region was relatively stable. And my father, who served in London as a diplomat, when his tenure ended, decided to drive back to Afghanistan. So we obviously crossed the English Channel, and then we drove from continental Europe via Turkey and Syria, Iraq, and Iran back to Afghanistan. And there was a convoy of 5 or 6 cars, It was completely safe. And my father said the only stretch where they had some worries was in Iraq because of bandits. But otherwise, I had my third birthday in Damascus, and it was a different era. And then, millions of tourists from Europe and the US also did the same thing. They drove, hitchhiked, drove from Australia all the way to Europe and vice versa. And I don't have the numbers, but I think that hundreds of thousands of tourists, mostly hippies, visited Afghanistan in the 70s. It was impoverished. It was sort of not a particularly developed country, but it was, it was stable and it was safe. And then, of course, it all changed. The most important years for our region were the late 70s, when the Russians, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. There was a coup d'etat. The toppling of the Shah's regime. In Saudi Arabia, where we had the siege of the mosque, which then forced the government to reverse some of its sort of more liberal policies. So a number of things happened. The peace deal between the Egyptians and the Israelis. A number of things happened that completely transformed the region.
But then, what would you say? What was the impact on Afghans living in the country?
It was horrific. The population of the country was 12 or 13 million in the late 70s, and when the Soviets invaded, of course, what followed was an insurgency, sort of a civil war, a communist regime backed by the Soviets with 120,000 troops, and then hundreds of thousands of Afghans on the other side, supported by the Americans and the Saudis and others. So within a couple of years, we had something like, I think, 7 million refugees. So half the country left Afghanistan. 3 or 4 million to Pakistan, the rest to Iran and Western Europe as well as the US. And then fast forward to the late 1980s, 1 million dead, 1 million handicapped. So it was and then the most mined country on the planet with still millions of refugees living outside the country. So it wasn't a particularly good experience for Afghanistan.
You mentioned how you grew up in different places around the world, but you also say that your heart stayed close to Afghanistan. How did you maintain such a strong connection despite being so far away?
Well, I think it helps if your family is very engaged in the country, its language, culture, food, and so forth. But I think it depends on the individual. And you can stay connected to a place by reading about it, your own memories of your experiences of your time in the place. But I think it was just, it was probably instilled in us by our parents.
What sorts of things did your parents do to instill that in you?
Talk about Afghanistan, I think, quite a lot. Engage with the Afghan communities. But we also read quite a bit about the country and its history. I think it was just probably a collection of things.
So probably many people in the audience also remember the very intense media coverage around the US withdrawal in 2021, but since then it feels like Afghanistan has largely disappeared from public attention. So it begs the question, what is, in your perspective, the biggest misconceptions foreigners have about the country?
Today?
Yes.
Well, I mean, there are obviously other tragedies and other events around the world that people focus on. Someone was complaining the other day that people are beginning to forget Ukraine. I mean, it's sort of, it moves on, right? But Afghanistan, so on the positive side, it's stable. You know, for 40 odd years, we saw conflict, but now, because one group's in charge, we can pretty much travel across the country. It's relatively safe. I think that's a plus. The levels of corruption we saw during the Republic days, when the Americans had a big presence, we don't see anymore. That's not saying that the regime is not corrupt, but they're relatively much better. On the flip side, technically girls are banned from going to school, high school. The country is ruled by a very sort of religious, in a group that's governing in a very exclusive manner. It's not a particularly inclusive governing system. So it's a sort of a mixed bag, but I think what hurts Afghans the most is the fact that the country is still sanctioned, or the individuals in charge are sanctioned. The economy is not really growing. It remains a relatively isolated country. And as a result, the economy has faltered. We're still on the verge of a humanitarian crisis. So there's a whole range of things that continue to dog the country.
Well, this group, of course, is the Taliban. You witnessed their first regime and their return to power, of course. Were the 2 decades in the interim just a blip? Is Afghanistan back to where it was, or are there noticeable differences in how they govern now compared to then?
Well, I think the Taliban have changed in the way that they, perhaps the way that they execute their decrees and the edicts of the leadership. The way they govern in the major cities is very much a laissez-faire approach to things. So despite certain bans, people have freedoms. For example, women continue to work. They work for us. They work for the government. Women continue to drive. The ones that wish to drive their vehicle, they can get from A to B. They sort of are tolerant of, people walking, because in the old days, women were not even allowed to walk unaccompanied. They had to always have a male member, walking with them or traveling with them. That's no longer the case in the major cities. And even when it comes to education, they turn a blind eye to schools, secret schools, to computer classes for girls, vocational training centers, and so forth. So I think in terms of implementation, they have a much more laissez-faire approach because the country's changed. So fast forward the 2 decades of international presence, the country's much better educated, there's a lot more infrastructure, the way that people see the world and see themselves is very different, mostly thanks to media and being exposed to things. So
how does their relationship with the media look now? You talk about when they came back into power, they were going through your offices like school children on a field trip. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that, you have to understand that it was a movement or a force that basically, was not in the cities. I mean, they had their sort of informants and others in the cities, but the fighting force was predominantly based outside the cities and villages, pretty much, hidden away in different places. A very classic approach to resisting the government and its American backers. But when they came into the cities, they had to adjust and they had to learn in terms of how to deal with people, how to address people, how to govern, how to maintain security. So as much as the concern that we had in 2021 was how much will the Taliban change this new Afghanistan, what's become apparent is how much the new Afghanistan is also changing the Taliban. So fast forward to 2024 or 2025, they can just, they can stop a car and address the ladies in the car, and they can be polite and they don't look away. And I think in the first few weeks they didn't quite know how to deal with people. So they're learning as they go along, just as much as I think the Afghan population is learning to deal with them.
But then, we cannot talk about the Taliban without talking about women. And in your book, there's a chapter about your sister where you say that there was no denying that none of us experienced Kabul the same way Vaima, my sister, and my mother did. So it makes me wonder, how did your sister's and mother's experiences teach you what it meant to be a woman in Afghanistan?
Well, Afghanistan is a very conservative country, always has been. And the freedoms that they enjoyed in the 60s and 70s were very unique, and pretty much it was things that my mother as a younger woman and my aunts and others, the elites of our major cities experienced, but the country itself was always quite conservative. But I think that the last 20 years has really been transformative for the country and its women. At least they could go to school, at least they had the opportunity to work. Was it an aberration? We'll find out. Now, they enjoy still some freedoms, but if they're not allowed to go to school or university beyond grade 6, I mean, you know, these are things we have to think about. But in some ways, the commitment of almost every family in the country is to have their girls go to school and get educated. And this is one of the interesting debates that we're always you know, discussing in our television programs, is how important it is for women to get an education. And this is not just a view that we support, it's a view that many within the Taliban support too. But it's not an easy place to be a woman in. And the question is, how do you go about changing cultural norms and the way that people view women and their rights? And it has changed a lot, but it has to change a lot more.
So what would you say would be the first step to change those norms?
I think education helps. I think, but the other thing which I think is important is that the changes have to come from within. They have to be organic. And I think Afghans, you know, we as Afghans, we have a responsibility to change mindsets within the country itself. I think to an extent, the 20 years where the internationals were present in the country, I think there were attempts made to impose these changes in a very sort of artificial way. And I think that the lesson from the 20 years was that it's got to be a lot more organic.
We can imagine now it's quite an experience to work in all these different regions, in different markets from across the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa. I mean, you started right with a small radio station, but how do you approach these vastly different audiences? Is that something that factors into your programming or your decision making when it comes to hiring, or?
I think all of the above. You have to have a good team, and you have to empower them, and you have to work with them, and you have to let them make decisions, major decisions. And Afghanistan's been the same, although we're Afghans. But we recruit, hire, bring in people who are really plugged into what's going on. But the other interesting thing is that, you know, the similarities that people have, you know, and that's why, like, you know, you're from the Netherlands. There are certain television formats that have worked well across the world, developed in Holland, but they somehow work in...
Afghan Idol being one of these.
Afghan Idol being one, Deal or No Deal. So many formats that, you know, companies in Europe and other places have developed, and vice versa. You know, why does a Korean format work so well in Latin America, for example, or a Turkish soap opera work somewhere else? So I think basically as people, we're not dissimilar, and we tend to react to things in a very similar manner. But you do have to adapt them for different markets. And I think it's usually a combination of taking a format, something that's worked well, adapting it for local tastes, and then sometimes you have to create things from scratch locally. Adapting
To taste is one thing, but you also broadcast in very politically volatile regions, right? Afghanistan, Iran, the Gulf states. Imagine there are a lot of red lines. What differences do you see in how government tries to control the media, or the Moby Group in particular?
Well, governments will always attempt to control the media, and that's even true in Western countries. There's always this strange dance with the authorities. You have to conduct, you have to manage somehow that, and you have to cross red lines sometimes. You have to push the envelope.
Is there a particular moment you push the envelope?
Every day. I mean, if we do it to this day. We do that in Afghanistan with the Taliban, both on the political front or cultural front. You know, and sometimes you go too far, and you have to, you know, sometimes.
What's a moment you think you went too far?
Well, well, sometimes you know, I mean, for example, one of the interesting things in Afghanistan today is that the Taliban have banned us from very specific types of current affairs programs where we bring in guests and they debate issues. And one of these gentlemen was very critical of the leadership of the Taliban in a manner that was not acceptable. So I think he's been arrested and they've banned all our programs, at least temporarily. So that's an example of the things that you can do that would, upset the people in charge. But also like music programs and so forth in the past. Afghan Idol, for example, which is a very famous and popular format, was very controversial to a lot of conservative Afghans. And it was something that got us into trouble on a regular basis.
So, on the topic of how different governments approach the media, as your company grew, you had to navigate under two very different presidents, being Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. So I wanted to ask you, how did each one of them approach the media, and what challenges did that pose for you and your company?
Well, in a lot of ways we were lucky that we developed, because don't forget, the government was very new in 2002, 2003. So was the media. So in a lot of ways we developed a lot quicker than the state could. So by the time they got their act together, media was already huge in the country, dozens of radio stations and TV stations, and they were debating and discussing all types of issues and airing all types of programs. So by the time they got their act in order, this is the government, the Ministry of Information, Culture and so forth, it was almost, you could say that the horse had bolted. So they were always a few steps behind us, which made it in some ways challenging for them in terms of controlling us. So, but they did, there were arrests, and we had dozens of individuals who got arrested, intimidated by the Karzai government, because they didn't quite like the way that the media organizations were scrutinizing the state and the government. For example, things to do with corruption, civilian casualties when the Americans or Afghan forces raided villages, ineptitude of the state itself in terms of infrastructure projects and so forth. So it was challenging, and then I've talked about it in the book in terms of there was a period that the Attorney General was after me for about a month, and I had to play it was a cat and mouse situation that I had to change houses over that period in order not to get arrested. Looking back, it was an exciting period, but it was stressful for everyone involved. Ashraf Ghani time was relatively more stable because I think people knew the boundaries. We understood how far we could push, and they also understood that they had limitations in terms of what they could do to media organizations. And of course, everything changed when the Taliban took over.
So, on the topic of Taliban, you've said in a previous interview for The Guardian that the Taliban forbid showing uncovered faces of menstruating women. So right now you're considering a soap opera featuring only women after the menopause, which in a way seems both absurd and telling. So how would you say those kinds of restrictions shape the stories Moby can tell in Afghanistan?
Well, for example, we can no longer have music on television. So that was the first casualty. And then they also banned soap operas. We used to produce some soap operas, and then we also used to buy drama series from, say, Turkey. And women can show their faces, but they have to cover their mouths. So they wear surgical masks as a sort of a way to deal with these new restrictions. I sort of mentioned that in passing, half joking, that if we can get menopausal women, technically they can show their faces, but who knows? We can try. The problem with the Taliban is that it's not, the movement has many different factions and many different individuals.
It's not monolithic.
It's not monolithic, and people tend to, view them as sort of one movement, but there are individuals within the Taliban who are far, a lot more pragmatic than others. But we still don't know which way the Taliban's going to go. It can either go even more extreme, or it may, approach things in a more sort of pragmatic or more open way. We don't know yet, and sort of we're sort of playing it by ear and just trying to assess which way it's going to go. So we've had to make some sacrifices, but on the plus side, we have launched a whole series of education programs, which I think are crucial, in particular for younger Afghans who can't go to school, both male and female. And the quality of the education has really dropped significantly. So these education programs are helpful to millions. I mean, we think that we have up to 10 million students today in Afghanistan, and a lot of these kids are watching television in order to understand mathematics and the science subjects better. And news as well. We continue to air. Most of our news is uncensored. We have to be careful in terms of how we address the leadership, but on almost everything else, we have almost no restrictions. So there've been, there are areas that we've had to make sacrifices, and other areas that we continue to do our work pretty much as before.
But then some could say that, you're not challenging the Taliban rule enough. So how would you respond to critics who say that, well, you don't challenge your power enough, especially in topics like women's rights?
We do. We've done, we've lost count, but I think that at some stage we had done something like 3,000 or 4,000 stories on girls' education, for example. So these challenges continue. But obviously it's going to be, phrased in terms of, they don't view as a challenge to their authority. And quite often it's, when you challenge, for example, their education policy, you do it by amplifying the voices from within the Taliban that oppose these bans. So yes, we have an obligation to challenge as much as we can. And of course, in a lot of ways, I wish we could do more, which we don't. But we just have to balance things in terms of, these are the things we can do, these are the things we cannot do. Because for us, there are obviously red lines, and there are times that we do think about potentially, shutting everything down and just walking away from it. Will that day come? It's always possible, yes.
Well, challenging power is one thing, but sustaining a media company over time is another. How did you manage to secure both the initial funding and the ongoing funding to keep Moby growing?
Well, initially, I think, which I've written in the book, we got a small grant from USAID, which allowed for the radio station to get established. And then, in Afghanistan, we were very lucky that the economy grew, and we grew with it along the way. But nowadays, it's still very much a commercial operation. We've had to reduce our costs significantly. Running a media company anywhere is challenging, whether it's in the West or Afghanistan. But we've always been, with the exception of year one, which we had a small loss, and 2022, we've always been a profitable or a break-even company.
You speak about the USAID and the grants that were key to your early success. Now we see in the US the agencies being practically dismantled, this seeming vacuum that's being left in place globally with its disappearance from the world stage. How do you see that affecting, similar projects in fragile states?
Well, I think that it's you have to bear in mind that USAID had a budget of 40 or 50 billion annually. They probably did a lot of good work in terms of some of the media initiatives and so forth, of which we were the beneficiaries of, or the humanitarian assistance in terms of helping victims of earthquakes and hurricanes and so forth, but also inoculating kids against, say, malaria or polio, as well as some of the AIDS projects that they have in Africa. But there was also a lot of wastage, and we saw that in Afghanistan, the billions of dollars that basically was spent, that if you were to go to Afghanistan today, there are no signs of the billions spent in the country. Roads constructed basically fell apart, buildings basically, ghost buildings, funding received, money allocated, but schools never built, clinics never built. So there was also a lot of wastage. So you can sort of understand why so many people were frustrated in Washington with some of the USAID projects. But I think what they also did was very important, in particular on the sort of emergency humanitarian front. And even in Afghanistan on the media front, a lot of money was spent. I'm not sure if all that money was spent well. So it's a complicated subject.
Speaking of complicated subjects, in your book you mention that somebody called you jokingly the Rupert Murdoch of Afghanistan. You admit it made you cringe then, it makes you cringe now, and you know, I get it. But I do want to ask about your actual relationship with this man. You know, he's an influential and controversial guy. How did that relationship come about, and to what extent is there a sort of influence on the editorial direction of what Moby produces?
Well, I met him through a friend called Tom Preston. He used to live in Afghanistan in the 1970s, left the country, was one of the founding members of the team that set up MTV, went on to become the CEO of Viacom, which was one of the other large media companies, and he introduced me to Murdoch. We had lunch, and then I told him about some of the ideas that I had about doing things in Iran, for example, the Persian market, and he seemed keen to do something with us, to my surprise, and then we did this joint venture with him. And then he became a shareholder in the group over time. Editorially, he never interfered, and he was always curious. And I mostly cringe because he's obviously Fox and News Corporation are substantial media conglomerates, whereas we were a very small operation. But he's an extraordinary figure. I mean, put the Fox News thing aside for a second, to have started with a small newspaper in Australia, to have developed this huge business. Interesting man. He's in his 90s, still very much engaged in the business. We learned a lot from him, but he was always very curious about new markets. First and foremost, a businessman. Was not. I obviously had political views, but I suspect many of his decisions are motivated by commercial gain.
What sort of things did you learn from him?
Well, I think he was a risk taker and always curious. I think these are really important attributes, for people like us, an entrepreneur. But also, I think that he also was always the fact that he could see new opportunities, whether it's with technology or formats. He took American Idol, I think was one of his programs back in the US. Do you remember The Simpsons, for example, was one of the shows that they produced early on. Football, whether it was in the UK, soccer, or American football, that they invested heavily in. So these are lessons in terms of, what programs, what formats you can develop that would draw audiences and maintain audiences.
So you've said that, Rupert Murdoch was always curious, but it seems to me that there are often some implicit expectations, something that is not spelled out directly, but you could see some kind of influence. So from your point of view, are editorial independence and donor interests mutually exclusive, or is there a way maybe to navigate both?
Well, in our case, I think the interesting thing was that in terms of the donors, say the other side, they had no expectations. Mm-hmm. And I think partially because they were just not managing their grants well enough. Because if I was them, I'd have certain expectations, but they had none. I think they had some general things about human rights and so forth, which they mentioned to us, but it was never like no one ever bothered coming to us and saying, oh, we've watched these programs and some are good, some are not so good. And I think it's partially because they had too much on, rather than sort of, by design, leaving people alone. And with investors, certainly we did not experience that with News Corporation. But if I was to invest in a company that was a media company, I'd take more of an interest, I would say. And depending on, especially if it was in a country that was some issues were sensitive, they were sensitive to, I would probably want to keep an eye on.
I think that's a wonderful moment to move to some audience questions. Does anybody, I've got a gentleman in the back with the blue shirt.
You mentioned earlier that you have defined red lines for yourself when you would shut down Moby. What are those red lines and how did you define them for yourself?
Well, one would be if they completely ban women from the workforce. Something like 25 or 30% of our employees are female. So that's very important for us. I mean, even if the ban is like they can't come to the office, but they can work from home, we may want to consider, we would think about it. But if it's an outright ban, then it becomes very difficult to operate within the country. Because we do have a lot of on-camera female employees, but we also have a lot of women who work behind the scenes in management, editing, producing, and so forth. That is certainly one area that, one red line for us.
Is that a practical concern or a principled one?
Principled one.
Any other audience questions? Gentleman in the green.
Well, I'm curious about the business model itself, especially in Afghanistan. Is there a thriving advertising industry that exists there and sustains you as a profitable company?
Well, there's Afghanistan's population is now 40 million, from 20 million in 2001, and it's growing at 3% per annum. So it's a much bigger population than a lot of people can imagine, especially in the 70s when the population was like 12 million. So it's actually growing quickly. And as a result of 2 decades of international presence and investment, we do have a consumer market, and they consume everything from soaps and washing powder to, and mostly soft drinks and so forth. One of the biggest advertisers are the energy drinks, and apparently per capita Afghans drink more energy drinks than any other place, which apparently is not unusual in a Muslim country where alcohol is banned. So one of our employees, I recall, used to have 8 Red Bulls a day, and he'd be always very stressed. So yes, the commercial market continues to grow, but it's not huge, but it can sustain people like us.
Do we have any other audience questions?
Gentleman with the green hat.
I'm just curious, do you operate in any other markets besides Afghanistan? And wait till you're there.
Well, we used to. We had one of the largest TV networks in Pakistan. We had a digital platform in India. We had a pan-Arab digital platform in a joint venture with Vice Media. We had a network in Iraq. And then we had a network in Ethiopia, in Amharic. But we exited many of those positions. The last one we had was Ethiopia, which we sold to Canal Plus or Vivendi. So we've had plenty of experience in sort of difficult, challenging markets. But the Afghan one, no one wanted to buy, so we're stuck with it.
Any last audience questions, please? The girl in the back.
Hello. Okay. I had 2 questions actually, because I study media here, so I was interested in preservation and conservation. Any philanthropic work that you're doing in Afghanistan related to media or maybe interfaith, on television?
Preservation of like our history and culture and so forth?
Yeah, because in the 70s, the media in Afghanistan, as you say, was locked away, right? Because it preached freedom. And I know, we read about a woman who went and tried to negotiate with the Taliban government to open some of these archives and see, and it was just almost destroyed, and now they're working on preservation and conservation. So, because you have more groundwork experience there, would you maybe know something about it, or if there are any philanthropic ventures that you are personally also interested in terms of faith and conservation of media?
Well, I mean, I think how to conserve one's culture, it's very important. So just on like for example, cooking, over the decade of, the Civil War and when the Soviets were occupying Afghanistan, we lost a lot of things along the way, cultural and so forth. So we try to bring a lot of those things back. For example, reintroducing Afghans to various cuisines of my grandparents' time, for example. Or even in terms of decoration and how people, furnish their homes, we try to go back. Because, rather than sort of buying cheap Chinese or Turkish imports, it was much better to empower local carpenters and local manufacturers. So that was a really important thing for us from a cultural perspective. In terms of our actual history in Afghanistan goes back a long way. We were just at the museum earlier on and we saw things from the Gandharan period from 16, 1700 years ago, even at the museum here in Amsterdam, how to value those things. And if you remember, the Taliban destroyed one of the large Buddhas in Bamiyan. But even in this environment, how to ensure that the current government, which has been against some of these things, for them to value the historical sites and statues and so forth. And I think media can help in terms of re-educating, informing both the members of the public, but also the governing body. And their approach has been a lot more responsible this time around. In terms of philanthropic work, we do a lot, whether it's working with the Gates Foundation in terms of eradicating polio, or other ways of helping the people. If people come to us and say, we have this idea, can you contribute in terms of advertising, time, even other resources, we're always up for it. And we work with them and have done so for, over the last 20 years.
Thank you for the amazing audience questions, and now let's get back to the interview. So, going back to the times of US invasion, you've said in the book that democracy as a word became almost a buzzword, and that it risks losing its meaning, but not for you. So, how did that belief shape Moby's journalism as Afghanistan's political reality became more complex?
Well, we were there to serve our audience, our viewers or listeners. And democracy, I think it ultimately boils down to justice. A just society is what we always should aim for. Now, what process we choose is not secondary, it's important, but I think the most important thing is how do we create a just society for our population. In Afghanistan, I think what we did was we created a system where people could vote, but a country that there was no civil society early on. People were not particularly educated. There was corruption, not as much as we saw later, but there was some corruption. So we sort of, in some ways, put the cart before the horse, that we rushed to elections, but we neglected so many other things. We created a judiciary that was very corrupt, deeply corrupt, a bureaucracy that was very corrupt, a government that was inept, couldn't really serve the nation, and a population that particularly wasn't well educated, and an education system that really didn't develop quickly enough. So then what we ended up with was, even with elections, it was deeply corrupt. In 2009, 2014, 2019, people were stuffing ballot boxes. So the political process lost whatever legitimacy it had in the early years. And I think to a large extent, it wasn't so much the Taliban winning, it was the government losing the trust and the faith of the population. So I was in Syria not so long ago in Damascus, and we met some of the civil society members in Syria. We're talking about elections. We're talking about creating a process where people could vote. And my only warning to them was that maybe you should focus on the basics in terms of the needs of the people, and then transition a little slower than how we transitioned from Taliban, fall of the Taliban, electing a president, electing a parliament that was, I think, in some ways rushed in a place like Afghanistan.
But how did this sentiment stay close to you and your team? That's something you mentioned.
Well, I think for us, we always felt that we took, obviously for us, there are many other templates to look at, whether it's the way that the BBC did its work globally in terms of its editorial guidelines and so forth. But I think also we were very hands-on. I mean, I used to sit in the newsroom, and we were guided also by the people working for us. They were particularly courageous, and they tackled issues, social, for example. How do you tackle things like pedophilia, which was rampant in some quarters in the country, to corruption, in particular involving the president and his family, for example. How to tackle the religious establishment, which we felt was sometimes backward and not particularly serving the different communities. Women's rights, for example. So there was almost nothing taboo for us in the early years, and that sort of also helped us because we gained the trust of the population. So we also did it for selfish reasons in terms of elevating our media group as much as we could. But ultimately, you have to always give people what they want. If that's what people are seeking, the truth, then you become truth tellers. If they want entertainment, you then create entertaining programs for them.
I mean, and I think this is particularly relevant in more democratic societies. I think the question here is twofold. One, what if the people want a mix or don't want the truth necessarily? And, I think governments in the West also have interests in manipulating media. They don't need to necessarily jail them or, kill them to get their point across. But do you see these sorts of things happening in the media landscape today? What is your...
In the West?
In the West.
Yeah, sure. Well, governments will always attempt to manipulate the media, and that will never stop. But as an editor or as a proprietor, you have to navigate this difficult terrain. It's always going to be difficult, by the way. But I think what's happening in the West is people feel let down. People feel let down by their governments. They feel let down by their, old media, in particular establishment media. So there's a great deal of anger in a lot of Western countries. That's why CNN, in a nation of 300 million people, has an average of 1 million viewers a day, not 30, 40 million viewers. So people, they have lost the trust of their viewers and listeners. And I think, but who's more right? I mean, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I don't think necessarily people want fake news, but sometimes, if you look at especially liberal media in the US, who are always pointing at Fox News, for example, they have to also look within. You look at the way they covered Biden's presidency, unwilling to challenge the fact that he was not, in a state to preside over the most powerful country on the planet, or his son's laptop and what was contained in that laptop, for example. So they have lost the faith of the population, of the trust of the population, and that's why people listen to Joe Rogan, for example, or they go to other outlets or other individuals.
But then, what would you say are other trends that concern you the most about the overall state of media on a global scale?
Well, I'm not concerned. I think that there's a crisis, but the crisis also presents individuals and institutions with opportunities. It's a much more fragmented market, and people, to an extent, go to an individual or an outlet that reinforces their views. But you can also, I think, create a business that would attract audiences. My concern is that there's still a lot of injustice in the Western world. A lot of people feel shortchanged. The gap between the rich and the poor is increasing. I mean, you're about to graduate from university, and for you to think of yourself buying a house, paying it off, having a comfortable life, I mean, it may seem daunting. It wasn't the case 20, 30 years ago. So people realize this, and will you be better off than your parents? And what about your kids? I think there's a sense of hopelessness in the world today, and challenges like the environment or immigration are issues that the different governments have not been able to at least reassure their voters that they're on top of.
I'd like to take this feeling of hopelessness that you mentioned and kind of flip it on its head, because you write about this conversation. You mentioned him earlier, Tom Preston, about this feeling of hope, I think. And it really stood out to me that he says kids everywhere, they sing in the shower, or pretend their hair is a hairbrush. It's a simple thing, maybe a little trivial, but very human. What does that sentiment mean to you? You've built this media company in one of the world's most unstable regions. Free expression is not a given there, but...
Well, you should always be very optimistic and hopeful. But we have challenging days ahead, and I think we also have to be realistic. Tom Preston calls me the most optimistic man that he knows. But you also have to be a little naive in the way you tackle things and go forward. Somehow things will be okay, but along the way it may not be that okay.
So on this note, thank you, Saad, for joining us today, and thank you for everyone in the audience for listening. And if you cannot get enough of room for discussion, we have more interviews to come. This Friday, from 11:30 to 12:30, we will welcome Mr. Ale Dorhat, the Dutch ambassador to Ukraine, to talk about the history of the conflict, how it is leveraged in diplomacy, and how intelligence can shape more informed decisions.
Next Friday, on the 13th of June, in the afternoon from 1 to 2 p.m., we'll welcome Nicolien van Verhoeven, the leader of the Nieuw Sociaal Contract, one of the parties that was in the coalition, to speak about the movers and shakers at the highest echelons of the political scene in The Hague. If you've been following the news about the fall of the Dutch government, be sure to be there. And also next Wednesday evening, from 7 to 9, we'll be hosting a pub quiz in the cafe right over there. If you'd like to test your knowledge and have some fun, join us by signing up via the link in our bio on our Instagram page.
But for now, thank you once again for joining us. It was a true pleasure. Please join us in giving the last round of applause for Mr. Saad.
Thank you so much for joining us.